The Rothschild family controlled more wealth than most European nations combined, yet they never kept their fortune in a single institution. This wasn't paranoia. This was centuries of survival encoded into financial strategy. While the world trusts centralized banking systems, Jewish financial wisdom operates on a completely different architecture, one built not from privilege, but from the constant threat of having everything stripped away overnight. When you can't trust the system to protect you, you build your own rules. And those rules have quietly shaped how generational wealth actually survives. Most people think wealth is about accumulation. Jews learned it's about distribution. There's a fundamental difference between having money and having money that can't be taken from you. Throughout history, Jewish communities faced systematic expulsion, forced conversions, property seizures. Governments would change, borders would shift, and entire fortunes would vanish with a single decree. So the question became, how do you build wealth that survives when the ground beneath you is constantly shifting? The answer created financial principles that seem counterintuitive to modern thinking but have proven unshakable across centuries of chaos. The first rule is radical. Never concentrate your assets where they can be frozen, seized, or controlled by a single authority. This isn't about tax evasion or hiding money. It's about structural resilience. When Jewish families built wealth, they understood that any centralized point of control was a point of vulnerability. Banks could be nationalized, accounts could be frozen, property could be confiscated. So wealth had to exist in forms that were portable, divisible, and internationally recognized. Diamonds became a preferred store of value, not because they were pretty, but because a fortune could fit in a pocket and hold value across any border. Gold and precious metals operated on the same principle. Skills and education were invested in heavily, because knowledge travels with you when nothing else can. This created what I call the principle of liquidity through diversity. Modern financial advisors talk about diversification as if it's about maximizing returns. The Jewish approach to diversification was about survival. You spread assets across different countries, different currencies, different physical forms. You never let one government, one institution, one authority have complete visibility into your total wealth. This seems extreme until you remember that within living memory, entire populations had their bank accounts seized, their businesses stolen, their property redistributed. Let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, because this history plays out differently depending on where your family experienced it. But the lesson remains universal. The second rule cuts even deeper. Build wealth that creates obligation, not just ownership. Jews couldn't rely on legal systems to protect their property rights, so they developed something more powerful than ownership. They became essential. When you loan money, you create a relationship of dependency. When you control supply chains, you become irreplaceable. When you provide specialized skills, you generate ongoing need. This is why historically Jewish communities dominated fields like merchant banking, diamond trading, textile manufacturing, and professional services. These weren't random choices. These were strategic positions that created economic relationships stronger than legal protections. Think about how this works. A king might seize Jewish property, but he still needs financing for his wars. A government might restrict Jewish land ownership, but it still needs the trade networks Jews control. You can steal someone's possessions, but you can't steal their expertise or their network relationships. This is the difference between owning things and controlling flows. Things can be taken. Flows create dependency. When your wealth is tied to your role in essential economic functions, confiscating your assets becomes economically suicidal for those in power. This principle built empires that survived when nations fell. The third rule is perhaps the most profound. Generational wealth isn't about inheritance. It's about installed capacity. Jewish families didn't just pass down money to their children. They passed down frameworks. The concept of teaching a child to think like an investor before they're even 10 years old. The practice of involving children in business decisions so they understand risk assessment naturally. The expectation that every generation would add to the family's intellectual and social capital, not just consume its financial capital. Wealth was seen as a responsibility that came with the obligation to grow it and the duty to prepare the next generation to do the same. This created family structures where financial education was as fundamental as religious education. Children learned negotiation at the dinner table. They learned about contracts by watching their parents conduct business. They learned about risk by understanding why certain decisions were made. By the time they reached adulthood, they had already internalized decades of practical financial wisdom. Compare this to modern wealthy families where children are often shielded from the realities of money until they inherit it, with predictable results. The statistics on generational wealth loss aren't accidents. They're the natural outcome of treating wealth as something to be protected from your children rather than something to prepare your children for. The fourth rule operates on a principle most people never consider: create value in the gaps that systems ignore. Jews were often legally barred from traditional professions, from owning land, from participating in mainstream economic structures. So they became experts at finding the spaces between the underserved markets, the financial instruments that established players overlooked. Money lending emerged not because Jews chose it, but because Christian doctrine prohibited charging interest, creating a market need that someone had to fill. This pattern repeated across centuries. Excluded from agriculture, Jews mastered trade. Excluded from guilds, Jews innovated in finance. Restricted from property ownership, Jews specialized in movable wealth. This forced innovation created a mindset that actively looks for what everyone else is missing. Where is there friction in the market that creates opportunity? What needs exist that current systems don't address? What emerging technologies or social changes will create new demands? This isn't opportunism in the negative sense. It's the ability to see structural gaps and build value in spaces others haven't recognized yet. Some of the most transformative businesses in history came from this approach. When everyone zigs, look for where zagging creates unrealized value. The fifth rule might be the most uncomfortable for modern sensibilities. Trust is earned through generations, never assumed through institutions. Jewish financial networks operated on reputation systems that were more binding than legal contracts. Your word wasn't just your bond, it was your family's entire future standing in the community. Break trust once, and you didn't just lose a business deal. You lost access to the entire network that your family had built over generations. This created an enforcement mechanism more powerful than courts. Legal systems could be corrupted, judges could be bribed, contracts could be invalidated by political changes. But community trust, once lost, was nearly impossible to rebuild. This is why Jewish business relationships often appear nepotistic to outsiders. It's not about excluding others. It's about the reality that trust takes time to establish when you can't rely on external enforcement mechanisms. When a legal contract might become worthless tomorrow, you need relationships built on something deeper than paper. You need people whose entire family reputation depends on their integrity. You need networks where betrayal doesn't just cost you one deal, but destroys your access to every future opportunity. This creates business ecosystems where long-term thinking dominates, because short-term gains that damage trust are existentially costly. The sixth rule shapes everything else. Build systems that function independently of your presence. Jews understood that they might need to flee with nothing, that they might be separated from their assets, that they might need to rebuild from scratch. So businesses were structured to operate through trusted intermediaries. Knowledge was documented and transferable. Networks were maintained through regular communication and mutual obligation. This wasn't about being absent landlords. It was about building resilience into every structure. Your wealth couldn't depend on you being physically present to manage it because history showed that presence couldn't be guaranteed. This created business models focused on systems and processes rather than personality-driven leadership. Documentation mattered. Training mattered. Creating redundancy mattered. When modern businesses talk about building systems that scale, they're often rediscovering principles that Jewish merchants implemented centuries ago out of necessity. The difference is motivation. Modern business wants systems that scale for growth. Jewish financial wisdom needed systems that survive disruption. The latter creates much more robust structures because it's designed for worst-case scenarios, not optimistic projections. The seventh rule ties everything together. Wealth is ultimately about options, not luxury. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Jewish financial thinking. The goal was never ostentatious displays of wealth. In fact, visible wealth was often dangerous because it attracted attention, envy, and confiscation. The goal was having choices when others had none. The ability to leave when staying became dangerous. The resources to start over when everything was lost. The network to rebuild when structures collapsed. Wealth meant freedom of movement, freedom of choice, freedom from dependency on systems that might turn hostile. This creates a completely different relationship with money than consumer culture promotes. Money isn't for buying things. Money is for buying autonomy. Every financial decision gets evaluated through this lens. Does this increase my options or decrease them? Does this make me more dependent on systems outside my control, or less? Does this tie me to a specific location or give me more flexibility? This is why debt was traditionally avoided in Jewish financial thinking except for productive purposes. Debt reduces options. Debt creates dependency. Debt ties you to systems that might collapse or turn against you. Freedom meant owing nothing to anyone, having resources in multiple forms and locations, and maintaining the ability to move quickly when circumstances required it. These rules weren't written in textbooks. They were encoded in stories, passed through families, demonstrated through actions. They represent centuries of pattern recognition about how wealth actually survives when you can't trust institutions to protect it. And here's what makes this relevant today. We're entering a period where institutional stability can no longer be assumed. Currency devaluations happen overnight. Banks fail. Governments change policies. Borders close. The conditions that made these Jewish financial principles necessary are becoming increasingly common for everyone. Understanding this history isn't about romanticizing persecution or suggesting that suffering creates wisdom. It's about recognizing that certain conditions force innovation in thinking. When you can't take stability for granted, you develop frameworks that work in instability. When you can't trust systems, you build alternatives to systems. When you know that everything might be taken from you, you focus on what can't be taken. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are practical frameworks for building resilient wealth in an increasingly uncertain world. The families that maintained wealth across generations did so by treating these principles as non-negotiable. They didn't follow them when convenient and abandon them when things seemed stable. They embedded them so deeply into their decision-making that they became automatic. This is the difference between understanding a concept intellectually and having it shape your instinctive responses. When crisis hits, you don't have time to remember principles. You need frameworks so deeply installed that they guide your actions without conscious thought. Everything we've explored here points to a fundamental truth about wealth that most people never grasp. Real financial security isn't about having a lot of money in one place. It's about having resilient systems that survive when single points of failure collapse. It's about building value that transcends any particular institution or government or market condition. It's about creating structures that outlast you because they're not dependent on you. This level of thinking separates families that build lasting legacies from those who experience temporary prosperity, followed by inevitable decline. Those who truly understand what we've uncovered here will recognize this isn't theory. This is tested wisdom from people who couldn't afford to be wrong. Drop this down in the comments. Resilience over accumulation. That phrase captures the entire philosophy we've explored. While everyone else chases bigger numbers, you'll be building unshakable foundations. You just gained access to financial principles that most people will spend their entire lives never encountering. This perspective that challenges everything modern finance teaches is exactly what this channel exists to deliver. Hit that subscribe button because this is just the surface level. Every video here peels back another layer of wisdom that history proved works when everything else fails. What I'm revealing in the next video will completely reframe how you see wealth creation itself. There's a deeper mechanism at play that connects all of these principles, and once you see it, You'll never look at money the same way again. That's coming next.